She's just the plus one, my mother told the gate guard, not even turning to look at me. 20 years in a uniform and she's still nothing but a desk clerk. Just swipe her card and let's move this along. She didn't look at me, but the guard did. His flashlight hit my card, stopped on the gold seal, and every drop of color left his face. He snapped to attention so hard his heels cracked against the pavement, lunged for the phone in his booth, and shouted, "Alert! We have an admiral at the gate." My mother laughed and told him he'd lost his mind. She had no idea that 30 years of being invisible had just ended. The year I turned 10, my father, a Navy ship welder with permanently blackened knuckles, dropped a bent chunk of steel shaped like an anchor onto our kitchen table hard enough to crack the formica. "Only things you can hold in your hand have value," he declared. That was the only doctrine we had. I was standing 3 feet away holding a certificate for first place at the county science fair. A scale model destroyer I'd built from scrap metal over 6 weeks of late nights. He looked at it, found no steel worth gripping, shrugged, and walked away without a word. 3 seconds later, my younger brother Grant burst in waving a gold plastic trophy for third place in a 50-yard dash. My mother scooped him into a bear hug loud enough to set the neighbor's dog howling, kissed the trophy, and put it on top of the fridge, center stage. I was always outside the frame. That pattern turned lethal at 16, at my father's funeral. Grant sobbed dramatically into my mother's arms while the whole family gathered around him. I stood behind a column settling $6,300 in hospital bills and writing 61 thank you cards by hand until 4 a.m. The next morning, my mother swept all 61 cards into the trash without reading one, telling me to clear the table for Grant's trophy display. At 18, I brought home a full-ride Naval Academy scholarship letter, one of 27 women selected out of 11,000 applicants. Earned through months of training I did alone in the dark. My mother picked it up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated and told me the Navy would just teach me to file paperwork for free, and that she hoped I wouldn't embarrass the family. Grant snorted from the couch. I folded the letter, zipped it into my bag, and made a decision that would define the next 30 years. I would shrink myself so my mother could orbit Grant undisturbed. I never cried. I just left. 40 feet below the Persian Gulf, at 0:30, I once knelt beside a device that would kill my entire dive team if my hands shook while I cut the detonation wire. I kept my heart at 60 beats per minute and severed it clean. That was my job. Explosive ordnance disposal. The person they call in when the math says no one survives. Out there, I wasn't invisible. I was everything. The moment I surfaced and got signal, the only text waiting was from my mother. "Grant needs $15,000 for a Porsche deposit ASAP. Wire it now, not like you have anywhere to spend it." No greeting. No idea that 10 minutes earlier I'd been face to face with a bomb. For 15 years, I quietly funneled my hazard pay, money earned specifically because there was a real chance I'd die on any given shift, into their accounts. I covered my mother's failed vineyard investment, Grant's fake consulting office, his rent, his wife Bethany's home renovations. Over $400,000 total. And through all of it, they never once stopped believing I was a low-level clerk answering phones somewhere. At Thanksgiving 2023, Grant, in an Italian suit I'd paid for, held court for 45 minutes about his consulting work for the Pentagon, casually dropping the name Admiral Mitchell, who supposedly called him for advice on a 9-figure classified project. The whole table was riveted. What none of them knew, Admiral Mitchell was my direct subordinate. 2 days earlier, he'd stood at attention requesting my authorization for a real mine-clearing operation. The classified project Grant invented didn't exist. My mother reached across the table, stroked Grant's arm, and turned to me. "See, Emily? Your brother works with admirals." Maybe he can get you a janitorial job at the Pentagon." The whole table laughed at the woman who actually held the authority to deploy their country's naval forces. I said nothing. I just filed it away. Months later, at my mother's house, I found a cream envelope buried in the trash under coffee grounds, a Navy SEAL, addressed to Rear Admiral Emily Burke, an engraved invitation to be guest of honor and keynote speaker at the most prestigious event in the EOD community worldwide. It had gone to her address because it was still my home of record from 20 years ago. She snatched it out of my hands and called it a scam. "You answer phones, Emily. Why would you get mail addressed to an admiral?" And tossed it back toward the trash, where it landed face up on the floor. Then she announced that she and Grant would be attending that very gala, using a ticket she'd manipulated out of a book club acquaintance so Grant could network. She ordered me to wear something plain, carry her bag, walk 3 steps behind her, and not speak unless spoken to. The night of the gala, I hid my flag officer ID in the lining of my handbag and got in the passenger seat. At the gate, my mother waved a phone full of Googled names at the guard, who ignored her and shined his light on me instead, standard procedure. My mother snapped that I was just the plus one, a desk jockey not worth holding things up for. I handed over my card. The guard's face drained white. He snapped to attention, sprinted into the booth, and radioed, "We have an admiral at the gate." My mother laughed and shouted that it was a mistake. "She's just my daughter, a file clerk." Then Master Chief Leon Briscoe stepped out, a man I'd once dragged out of a burning blast pit in Iraq, and delivered a parade ground salute. "Admiral Burke, ma'am, it's an honor. We've been waiting for our guest of honor all evening." The car went silent. My mother's hands froze on the wheel. Grant made a strangled sound in the back seat. I stepped out alone, straightened my dress, and walked into the gala without looking back. Inside, 1,000 officers in dress whites rose as I entered. A 20-foot photo of me hung behind the stage. Guest of honor, Rear Admiral Emily Burke, EOD. My mother and Grant were seated at a hastily added back table, faces ashen, name cards handwritten at the last minute. The same Grant who'd spent Thanksgiving name-dropping a man who was actually my subordinate, now surrounded by the real professionals he'd been impersonating. I gave my keynote about people who clear the path through darkness so others can walk safely. Sacrifice that asks for no audience. Near the end, I looked straight at my mother's table and said, "Silence is not a tragedy. It is the mission, as long as it's a choice, not something forced on you by the people who should have seen you first." She stared at her lap for the rest of the night. Grant said nothing. Afterward, Colonel Priya Anand, who'd once pulled me out of a collapsed structure in Kandahar, cornered me in a hallway. "You disarmed a daisy chain IED in a sandstorm without flinching," she said. "Your mother says one cruel sentence and you fold. How much more are you going to hand over to people who use you as a cash machine?" I rode home alone in a staff car and, in the back seat, canceled every automatic transfer to my mother and Grant, 12 transactions, each one severed like an artery. Then I emailed them both. "All financial support terminates at midnight. Non-negotiable." Attached with my unclassified service record, Rear Admiral, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 3 combat deployments. Within the hour, my mother's card declined at a restaurant in front of her book club. Grant's business partners ran an actual background check and discovered he'd never held a security clearance or consulted for anyone. His entire lifestyle had been funded by the sister he called a paper pusher. Bethany called sobbing, begging me to fix it. I told her there was nothing to fix. They were just facing the truth. A week later, my mother showed up at my office unannounced, mascara already dried on her cheeks, and launched straight into guilt. My father would be ashamed of me. Grant hadn't eaten in days. The neighbors were talking. I let her rehearsed speech run dry in total silence. Then I opened my secure cabinet and set my silver star citation on the desk in front of her. The record of diving into mined waters under fire to save 11 men. She read it, and the paper slipped from her shaking hands. "You are not crying because you hurt me," I told her. "You are crying because you were exposed." A month later, she called and asked me to come to the house. On the kitchen table sat my father's old toolbox, untouched since his death. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, were two things: a 20-year-old newspaper clipping of my Navy commissioning, laminated, and my old science fair certificate, the one he'd shrugged at, also laminated. Beneath them was a small piece of scrap steel, hammered into the shape of an anchor, with 5 words etched into it: "Anchor of my life. My daughter." My mother told me she'd found it clearing out the closet, that my father had never said a word about any of it to her. He'd seen exactly who I was from the beginning. He'd simply never learned how to say it out loud. She asked me, finally, why I'd let her treat me like nothing for 30 years. I told her the truth. I'd taken my father's philosophy and applied it to the wrong war. I made myself invisible so she and Grant could take up all the space, and in doing so, I taught them how to dismiss me. Neither of us was entirely innocent. Unconditional sacrifice without boundaries doesn't create gratitude. It creates entitlement. At the next family reunion, the wall that had held Grant's trophies for decades was stripped bare. Grant himself stood on a chair and hammered up a frame holding my Rear Admiral appointment letter and silver star citation. Then hung my father's small welded anchor beside it, his philosophy and my blood, side by side. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't say a single self-promoting word all evening. Before dinner, my mother stood, gripped the table for balance, and said, "This is my daughter, a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, a woman who disarmed death with her bare hands to protect the people beside her. I forced her to be invisible. I told her she was